Hello, and welcome back. My name is Dr. Doug Smith, and this is the series of videos that we are calling the Opioid Monologues. This is the 9th video in the series. Here we are going to deconstruct a press release from the FDA and featuring the then FDA Director, Dr. Scott Gottlieb. I think it is important for the future generations to understand the role of groupthink. No one would argue that the role of the FDA was to protect the citizens from exactly the type of poisoning that we are seeing occur within the DNA of the citizens exposed to opioids. No one would argue that the FDA dropped the ball and failed to recognize what Moshe had warned about as early as 2011. Remember this article by Moshe? Okay? And this quote, remember we read this quote together? Let's read and share this quote again. The realization that long-range damage could be caused without changing the DNA sequence has important implications on the way we assess the safety of chemicals, drugs, and food, and broadens the scope of definition of toxic agents. That quote was clearly directed at agencies such as the FDA and as a warning to be on the lookout and to protect the people from the type of genetic toxicity that could occur from methylation of the DNA. But it looks like the FDA missed the article. Okay? Did this type of poisoning occur? Oh, most definitely. Just look at the 4 excellent studies by Nielsen in 2009, Shorbov in 2012, Walkman in 2014, and Walkman again in 2018. Moshe predicted the toxicity, and Nielsen, Shorbov, and Walkman found it. Too bad the FDA has missed all this science. So exactly what was the FDA spending its time and resources doing during this opioid crisis? That's something we are going to jump into today, and by deconstructing this FDA press release and from November of 2017. I just want to make one more point, and before we jump into this FDA press release. In the last video, we discussed that there is already a lab test that could be available and that can accurately measure the level of poisoning, the level of toxicity, the level of damage to an individual's DNA. This level of damage can simply be determined by measuring the level of methylation that has occurred. The opioids cause DNA methylation, and we can measure in the lab this level of methylation. And I just wanted to point out the obvious, that this ability to utilize a lab test is a huge nail in the coffin of the disproven diagnosis of opioid addiction. And I want to point out to those people at ASAM and SAMHSA that if you are going to continue your agenda-driven behavior, you will need to address this lab test. This lab test for the methylation is so powerful that we could have opened this entire series that we're calling the Opioid Monologues with the existence of a lab test for methylation. But I wanted the viewer to see not only the science, but more specifically, I wanted the viewer to see the dishonesty of these so-called experts. Okay, let's move on now and to this press release from the FDA dated November 2017. Now we see here the title. FDA grants marketing authorization of the first device for use in helping to reduce the symptoms of opioid withdrawal. By the way, autonomic conflict is a true medical emergency, and you don't want to help someone endure the symptoms of autonomic conflict. You want to stop the autonomic conflict. Now, this is a device designed to go on your ear and help endure the agony and suffering of autonomic conflict. Now, this raises a couple of basic questions. Why would any physician want their patient to continue with the symptoms of autonomic conflict? Autonomic conflict is a neurological emergency. Why would you want to continue the neurological emergency? Why not just stop the process and with buprenorphine? Emergency over. Furthermore, we know there's this second epidemic looming in the shadows called opioid-induced adrenal insufficiency. We do not know enough about the etiology of opioid-induced adrenal insufficiency. But the Smith hypothesis put forth that it's the constant and persistent overstimulation of the adrenal gland by the sympathetic nervous system that finally burns out the adrenal gland itself. Remember, this big surge in epinephrine that we saw in the Kinebaum article, remember this? Okay? All right, remember that big surge in epinephrine? And remember this big nerve from the sympathetic nervous system and going straight into the adrenal gland? Do you really want to take a chance with your patients and leave them in autonomic conflict? This FDA-approved device isn't lowering the level of autonomic conflict. This device simply blocks some of the noxious feelings from reaching the brain. Autonomic conflict in all its fury is still raging within the body. And to the FDA, that's okay? Because that's exactly the message that the FDA is sending to the medical community. Oh, these symptoms are continuing to rage within the body, but it's okay. Okay, all right. FDA, I got a press release of my own for you. It's not okay to allow autonomic conflict to continue to rage unabated within the human body. It's unethical, immoral, and against all standards of medicine. And that's my press release. Okay, let's now continue with this press release and on a medical device that helps an individual deal with the agony of autonomic conflict in which all control is lost over your internal organs. We see early in the press release a quote by Dr. Scott Gottlieb, then director of the FDA. And let's take just a moment here and look a bit deeper into Dr. Scott Gottlieb. And we see here in Wikipedia a most impressive resume. Look at this. Physician and investor, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, partner at the venture capital firm New Enterprises Associates, a member of the board of directors at Pfizer, and a contributor to CNBC. Okay, but now let's look right over here at this press release. Okay, and when given the opportunity to make the big breakthrough on the opioid crisis, did Dr. Gottlieb rise to the occasion, or did he just drink the Kool-Aid and fall in lockstep with the opioid addiction nonsense? And we see the answer right here and in his own words. Given the scope of the epidemic of opioid addiction, no. Given the opportunity as director of the FDA, Dr. Gottlieb missed all the scientific evidence, okay? Dr. Gottlieb missed all the scientific evidence from Moshe, okay? Nielsen, Shorbaugh, Walkman. Dr. Gottlieb failed to note the toxicity to the DNA by the opioids that the science had already well documented. Instead, he showed no intellectual curiosity and just went with the flow of opioid addiction. Now, I want to point out something amazing in this press release, and it's not shining an impressive light on Dr. Gottlieb. Okay, but first, a quick message to those future generations looking back at us. Note the word sobriety in the quote from Dr. Gottlieb. The actual quote, to help those currently addicted live lives of sobriety. Now, this is somewhat a throwback to the temperate and Protestant roots of our culture. This concept that these genetically damaged people would be better off if they would just live a life of sobriety. This concept is so pervasive today, it even made its way into a press release by the FDA. I should point out one more detail for our viewers, okay? This medical device that helps allow an individual to deal with the sheer agony of autonomic conflict, this device didn't happen in a vacuum, okay? Let's expand the last quote by Dr. Gottlieb a bit. To help those currently addicted live lives of sobriety with the assistance of medically assisted treatment, okay? This message of sobriety and medically assisted treatment is a reference to another FDA-approved medication called Vivitrol. It is nothing but a once-a-month depot injection of naltrexone. The idea being that this will help prevent a relapse and allow the person to live an opioid-free life. But now, wait a minute here. Remember the study by Kinebaum, okay? They gave naloxone and put the person into autonomic conflict and measured massive levels of epinephrine. Well, here's a newsflash for you. Naloxone and naltrexone are basically the same drug to the body. So there's some minor differences, okay? But essentially the same. Now, we saw in the Kinebaum study how administration of naloxone produced a toxic state in the body and with autonomic conflict. And now you want to use this medication that produces a toxic state as a treatment? Have you really thought this through? Did you do any studies on epinephrine levels with Vivitrol? Have you checked to see if there is any relationship between Vivitrol and opioid-induced adrenal insufficiency? Okay, the tough part about Vivitrol is that the person has to sit through 10 days of autonomic conflict before the first monthly shot of naltrexone can be administered. Most people cannot withstand autonomic conflict for 10 days. Okay, and thus this brilliant earpiece to help an individual deal with the autonomic conflict and eventually get the injection. See, there is money. There is money to be made here. Okay? If we fail to treat the emergency condition of autonomic conflict, or if we inadvertently increase the person's risk of opioid-induced adrenal insufficiency, well, that's just collateral damage. There is money to be made here. Now, last item on this press release from the FDA, and the brilliant quotes from the FDA director, Dr. Scott Gottlieb. And this is simply amazing. This is something future generations will, well, quite honestly, they're going to laugh at us. Okay, and the physician investor, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, is unfortunately going to be the brunt of the jokes. Okay, look right here on this press release. Okay, look at how they did this study. They used the cows as their yardstick, the clinical opioid withdrawal scale. Remember, this was a piece we pulled off the ASAM website and said this is nothing but pure autonomic conflict. That's what the CALS is a list of symptoms that are autonomic conflict. It is blatantly obvious on this list of symptoms that this is nothing more than pure autonomic conflict, and with both branches of the autonomic nervous system operating in a toxic manner. And yet here is this CALS being used as a way to measure the effectiveness of this medical device. Okay, all these people being studied, all these people being looked at, okay, and not one researcher, not one scientist recognized the obvious, that the symptoms they were looking at was nothing more than autonomic conflict. Wow, the power of groupthink. Okay, Dr. Gottlieb, you do work for Pfizer, the New Enterprises Associate, American Enterprise Institute, CNBC, and you are a clinical professor at the New York University School of Medicine, and you are the director of the FDA. Yet you failed to recognize the clinical entity that is autonomic conflict, a true neuroendocrine emergency. My guess is that fact is going to be added to your Wikipedia page. Okay, let's hold here for now. I think the future generations have a pretty good idea what we are saying. The power of groupthink, the role of money, and the missed opportunities for a true recognition of the reality that there was nothing here called opioid addiction. This is simply a toxicity to the DNA that was completely missed, even when studied in detail. Amazing. My name is Dr. Doug Smith, and these are the Opioid Monologues.